Welcome back to my channel, you guys. I'm excited for today's video, but I will say I'm excited to also just like film this video and kind of get it out of the way. It is going to be an update for my cool toned chopping block series, and I feel like I had all these ideas and plans in my head for like what I wanted this series to be, and I feel like because I have so many cool tone palettes, like I really didn't even like scratch the surface of getting my entire cool toned palettes into the video. I think I included 32 or 34 palettes, and actually through this chopping block I do have, I believe it's 10 palettes that I have since decided to declutter from my collection, which is just over 25% of the palettes that were on the chopping block, which I'm really happy with because the point of this series is to keep my very large eyeshadow palette collection as curated as possible, and really just like if a palette is not going to serve a purpose in my collection, I want to be passing it along to my mom, sister, friends, family, whatever it might be, just so that like these palettes are continuing to get love. I love to test and try new eyeshadow palettes, but I'm also someone I found that feels really overwhelmed by having too many choices. So it's like this weird thing where like I literally want to buy every single eyeshadow palette, but like I don't want to keep them all in my collection. So initially going into this, I was thinking I was gonna have so many different like eyeshadow looks to share with you guys as I tried to like no pan left behind palettes that I was truly considering decluttering. I'm trying to like include all palettes in my collection that fit into like the color story I'm going for. So you'll find my next installment is going to be like mauves or like dusty purples and pinks. So a little bit more specific in terms of like the aesthetic or the color story. But I'm trying to like grab all of the palettes from my collection that kind of have shadows that like fit the aesthetic, and then kind of like compare all those palettes against one another and see if I can chop palettes out of my collection from there. I don't know if I'm making any sense at all, but today I'm going to be going over with you guys the cool tone palettes from my collection that I have decided to declutter. These you will already know are declutters if you watched my end of year palette collection and declutter. You'll already know. So I'm going to be going through them all with you today and kind of just how I kind of made the decision to chop these palettes out of my collection, potentially show you some swatches. That's really what I want to do in the future, is like really swatch shades against one another. But I feel like I didn't go into this first installment of this series with the best plan. So that's kind of what I'm like, I was considering not even like making this video, but I'm like, I do want to update you on the cool tone palettes I've decided. Like if you didn't watch my palette collection to declutter, I want to like follow up on that video, but then the installments going forward, I'm hoping to have more like swatch comparisons or even like eyeshadow looks that I've created with the palettes to share in each installment. This introduction has been like 3 minutes long. I'm so sorry, but if you're interested in seeing what cool toned eyeshadow palettes from my collection are getting the chop, stay tuned. First, if you have yet to subscribe to my channel and you like project painting content, palette themed content, or just chit-chatting about makeup, I'd love if you'd consider subscribing before moving on. And other than that, let's jump into the video. Okay, you guys, I will leave the original video linked down below in case you're interested in seeing, I think 32, 34, 36, somewhere around there. I feel like, and there's so many palettes that I missed, but I started with about 34 eyeshadow palettes, I believe, and you can see all the palettes included in that video. And like I said, I do have 10 eyeshadow palettes I have decided that I'm going to be decluttering. Also, as mentioned, next installment, I've already filmed it, I think it's going up after this video though, is going to be like mauves and dusty pinks and purples. I feel like that's perfect for like the time of year that we're in. Entering February, I'm going to be wanting to do like all the purple pink romantic sort of eyeshadow looks, and I was thinking doing green after that as we enter March. But if you have a specific like palette aesthetic that you'd like to see me like curate a chopping block episode for, let me know. I'm not, and this is where like I'm currently not going to go through all of the palettes that were on the chopping block. I'm literally just going to like share with you the ones that I have decided are getting the boot, and if I have like shades in the palettes to compare to other palettes that were in the chopping block that I'm not chopping, I'll do that. But I don't think I'm making any sense. This is why I need to just like get this video out of my mind and move on to the next. But first up, we have the Charlotte Tilbury Exaggerized Quad, and I decided that like Another thing is I opened up all 34 eyeshadow palettes and kind of like opened them up, laid them out, and palettes that like I wasn't as excited, like when I open the palette and look at the palette, if I wasn't excited about the color store or wasn't like, ooh, like I can think of some looks that I would be excited to create with this palette, then those were the palettes that I heavily focused on for like, am I really going to keep this in my collection? And the Charlotte Tilbury quad, while I think it's really nice, and if I had a more minimal makeup collection, I feel like I would actually get a ton of use out of this palette. This is just not my personal aesthetic anymore. Like, this is just not what I'm going for, even on an everyday basis. Yes, I could create a very wearable, easy, don't have to think about it, everyday sort of look for work. And I think I really will miss this shade specifically right here. But I feel like my mom could get so much use out of this quad. And it does not make sense for me to keep this quad in my collection, for me to just reach for it a couple times a year, and that's it. There's not like special shades in this quad that I'm like keeping the palette around for. It's not like a really special indie palette that even if I'm not only reaching for it a few times a year, there's like a very unique shade in my collection. There's nothing like that in this quad. So we're gonna get rid of this. I've also decided I'm decluttering this one from Mockingbird Beauty. This color story is just not something that I look into this and I'm like, I don't feel excited about this at all. Personally, they did send this to me, which was so incredibly kind, but it's just not a color story I ever see myself getting excited about. These are not the type of blues that I like reaching for when I reach into a blue, and then I don't really love like a gray eyeshadow look on myself. So for that reason, I'm like, it does not make sense for me to keep this around when I could pass this along to someone who would love it so much more. I did decide that I am ready to declutter 2 Sigma palettes. I wasn't surprised about the Sigma Untamed and my decision to get rid of Sigma Untamed, just because I feel like I've hemmed and hawed about this one for so long. And when I tried to use this in my No Pan Left Behind series earlier this year, I couldn't get myself to even like No Pan Left Behind this palette, which really kind of like stuck out in my mind as like, okay, then like you really probably don't need this palette in your collection. The shades that I really like in this palette, like I do like the shade Instinct, which is this really beautiful kind of dusty purple shade, but I have literally, this is not even everything, but like a basket full of palettes that have a very similar shade to that. So like it's not like I'm like, ooh, I want to do a dusty purple look today, I'm gonna reach into Sigma Untamed specifically for the shade Instinct. I don't feel that way. I also do really like the shade Hustle Spirit, and I've been keeping it around for these green shades right here, but I also have so many better green shades throughout my collection that I was like, I'm literally keeping this palette in my collection to sit and collect dust. So Untamed we are getting rid of. And then I have also decided to declutter Sigma Enchanted. This one was a little bit more of a difficult decision because I have used this palette quite a bit in its lifetime with me. I do really enjoy the shades Moonglade, Budding, Plume, Cosmos, and Metamorphosis. And even looking into this palette, I'm like, ooh, it's still so pretty, and I get so excited about it. The 2 shades I think that are most difficult for me to like kind of like leave behind or give up would be Metamorphosis, which is this really beautiful iridescent like blue-brown shade. I love a blue-brown shade, but this is not even probably in my top 3 or top 5 blue-brown shades throughout my collection. So like, I have other shades that are better, that are similar to that in my collection. And then the shade Cosmos is this really beautiful, like, kind of like green taupey silver. It's a really, really beautiful shade. But I also have shades, maybe not even like exact dupes of this, but shades that I prefer over this shade in my collection. Like, it's not like I'm ever like, I absolutely must reach for Sigma Cosmos today, like what am I doing? It's never like that. So this is another one that I feel like is just, at this point in time, I feel like, especially as my indie palette collection has grown so much throughout 2023, this is just a palette I'm never going to be excited to reach for really anymore. So for that reason, that one is also getting the chop. I have 3 Colourpop palettes that I decided I am ready to part ways with. I was kind of surprised about this one. This is Colourpop Stone Cold Fox. I thought I would want to keep this, and I will say I probably will end up taking out a few of the shimmery shades. Like I'm gonna take out Magnetic Moon and I'm gonna keep that shade. Same thing with Baby Doll. Probably Caving In. A couple of these shimmers I'm gonna depot. I have like a depotted Colourpop palette where I keep a bunch of single shadows, but I just was so unimpressed with the matte formula in this palette. And I don't know if it's because this is an older palette in my collection, potentially the formula is changing some, but I specifically remember trying to create a look with this row of shades here and my shadows just kept dusting away to nothing, and I kept trying to build it up and then it would dust away to nothing. And this is like the Colourpop formula I'm finding has a ton of kick up and just is not the best. Like there are definitely different levels of Colourpop quality, and this is just not the top tier Colourpop quality in my opinion. This is not a palette I feel I would ever be excited to reach into for the matte shades. And that being said, it's also like there's some really beautiful shimmer shadows in this palette, but I would never think to just be like, oh, I can keep the shimmers that I like separately and still they probably won't get a lot of use. But I just found I have so many better shadows similar to this throughout my palette collection, throughout like my Natasha Denona I Need a Nude. I've been really loving my Persona Identity 1 again, and the mattes are just so much better than in this palette, so there's no sense in me keeping this. And then the other two that I decided to get rid of, I'm actually kind of surprised about this one too, because I thought if I was going to get rid of Stone Cold Fox, I would keep That's Taupe. But I went a couple of days to create looks with this, and I remember this from in the past. I was so frustrated when creating like my base with my matte shadows, just because it's that really like almost dry, chalky, just like dusts away into nothing sort of formula, and it just does not work on the eyes. I do know that I'm for sure going to take Snake Eyes out, and probably the shade Slated, which is the like super shock shadow within this palette. I will keep those, potentially even Constrictor and Cold Blooded, but I'm just so unimpressed with the mattes in this palette that like I cannot justify keeping this palette around in my collection. It is a palette I do not get excited to reach for. In fact, I think it's going to be a pain to reach for it just because I feel like I don't easily get the look that I'm creating. And again, I'd much rather reach into like my Persona Identity 1 palette over this. So not keeping that. And then finally we have Colourpop Making Mauves, and I'm pretty sure this one has like just absolutely gone off, because like when I open this, and I've never had this with eyeshadow before, when I open this palette, it literally smells like Play-Doh, and I'm like, that is not something I want to put near my eyes. I did try and create one look with this, and I was not impressed with the way that the look turned out. I'm gonna swatch. Even like, yeah, even swatching like the shimmer shade, I'm not gonna keep any part of this palette, because even swatching the shimmers, it's just dry and crumbly. I feel like the formula has just truly gone off within this palette, and it makes no sense for me to keep it anymore, especially because like I don't want to be putting something that is expired on my eyes. I will say I will really miss this Super Shock shadow, but I have like a million shades similar to that throughout my palette collection, so like we can get rid of Colourpop Making Mauves. The final two palettes, these were difficult decisions. So up first, I have this one from LH Cosmetics. It's the Daybreak palette. There's nothing wrong with this eyeshadow palette aside from like I look into this and I just feel so bored when looking into it. Not really the tones that I am excited for, and really for me, the one shade that I could see myself keeping this palette for is the Blue Brown shade. And so I took the Blue Brown and I swatched it out. And yes, it does look very, very pretty. But then I swatched it against, and I hope I have it up here. I do. I swatched it against the Blue Brown shade in the Sydney Grace Tiny Marvels palette, the shade Scarab. And I mean, there's really just no comparison. No, they're not like exact dupes, but like this just looks dull in my opinion. And this one, while it's almost more of like a green brown sort of shade, I'm going to want to reach for this shade right here 10 times out of 10 over this shade right here. So because that was really the only shade I was like hemming and hawing over, that's where I was like, okay, I can definitely declutter the LH Cosmetics. And that's really the purpose of this chopping block series for me, is just to really evaluate which shadows within the palettes am I like wanting to keep the palette for. If it's the majority of the palette, that is great, we're keeping the palette. But if it's one or two shades, likely throughout my palette collection, I can find something that I'm keeping that is like a very similar shade to it. So that is what happened here, and I need to reach for this so soon because that is such a beautiful shade, Scarab. So LH Cosmetics is getting the boot. And then this one really surprised me. So the Lunar Beauty Eternal Eclipse, never would have thought that I was going to declutter this one, but I pulled this out to reach in and create a look. And actually looking into this, I'm like, I like the color story. I think it's beautiful. It does kind of inspire me to like want to create looks. But then I started to like create my look and I was like, I'm just not super excited about it. I will say like the mattes in here are beautiful. They perform really nicely. And I think they're like good, like a good grounding of matte shadows for this palette. But I was like, it's not like I reach into this palette for these matte shades. So are these matte shades truly unique to my collection? No, not really. Like I can't, there's not one shade I look in here that I'm like, I can't find something similar in my collection. They're all like, I can find similar shades. So then I started to look and see, okay, like this bottom row, I've been really into blues lately, but still like these are just not really the blue shades I'm excited about. I think Starry Eyed is really pretty. So then I swatched out Starry Eyed and I was like, okay, that's really just like a metallic deep gray shade. When am I ever reaching for a metallic deep gray? And I also have the Natasha Denona Xenon palette, like, and granted, like, nothing like an exact dupe, but we have Cygnus in here, which let me swatch these two. Like these actually, Cygnus is on top, the Starry Eyed is on the bottom. Starry Eyed is actually a little bit deeper even, and I am more likely to reach for a shade like Cygnus. So I was like, okay, we're good to go with that one. Are there other things? I've always really enjoyed this top row. So then I was like, okay, let's swatch Flare. Flare has always been kind of like an inner corner like highlight for me. There's Flare swatched right there. I swatched it and I was like, that's really almost like looks just like a lid topper, and I can use any golden highlight in my collection and get the same effect. So let's not keep the palette for Flare. So then I was like, okay, Meteor and Gold Dust, not really my favorites. Meteor, and when I say not my favorites, I mean like they're just not like shades that I personally reach for that frequently. So we have Meteor swatched right here, which is this really beautiful kind of like satin taupey sort of shade. But I literally couldn't tell you the last time I reached into this shade. Plus I like something a little bit more metallic on my eyes. So I pulled out the Ghost Town palette, which is not really similar, but like kind of similar, but not. And I swatched this shade, which I wasn't expecting to be like an exact dupe by any means, but this one has like almost, it's like a champagne, like there's not really a taupiness to it, but I like this one a little bit more. And then the other two shades I wanted to swatch Meteor against was this shade right here out of the Rowan Mood Forever quad. Not super similar. I don't know, there is the Rowan Mood Forever, and then there is, what was it, Meteor? Not super similar, so I still wasn't quite getting like the aesthetic I was going for, not like a satin taupe. Then I swatched it against this shade right here from the Rowan 1111 quad, and those were most similar, still not the like most similar. So I will say like still I'm kind of on the hunt throughout my palette collection to find something like this satin taupe shade, but I'm like, again, when was the last time I really even reached into this palette for that shade? Never. And then I also wanted to swatch Adamantia, this silver, and I was like, okay, I think this is such a beautiful shade, but I also like, I never wear a silver, you guys. I'm running out of room to swatch, so I'm gonna swatch this on my hand. That is a really beautiful silver. Keep in mind, I never reach into a silver, but I also just purchased the Natasha Denona Xenon palette, and so I swatched it against Super Ionic, this one right here, and I don't know how well you'll be able to tell. So this is the one out of the Lunar Beauty, this is the one out of the Natasha Denona. This one is almost, well, not almost, this one is much less intense, and if I'm going for a silver, it's gonna be one that's a little less intense because I don't love a silver like gray smoky eye. That's just not what I like on my eyes. So I was like, okay, this is a really beautiful palette, but I am not using it. So like, let's pass it along to my mom, my sister, someone else that's gonna use this, because right now I'm not using it. So I did decide ultimately that I was also going to be getting rid of the Lunar Beauty Lunar Eclipse palette. And I think, I'm like, I swear there was one more palette. I just don't know which one it was or where it was. My desk is such a mess right now. I've also been waiting to film. I had pulled out all the palettes that I originally included, and I was like, I'm just gonna talk about the ones that I'm decluttering. But my desk is so cluttered and filled with things right now. I'm like, we need to clean up here. But those are ultimately the, I only had 9 to share. I swear there were 10. But we're gonna say those are the 9 palettes that I did decide to declutter out of the original 32 or 34 palettes. So again, cutting it by like 25-26% feels really good. I don't know if we're going to be as successful with the mauve, dusty pink, dusty purple category, because as I was filming the video even, I was like, I really do kind of like a lot of these palettes, which is crazy because I feel like I'm like, I don't know if I like dusty pinks and dusty purples anymore. And then as I pull out all those palettes, I'm like, oh, I don't know if I could declutter any of these. So this is another like fun thing and fun exercise for me as well, just to kind of like really think through like, what shades do I actually like using, what shades don't I use, and also to take that knowledge into like what palettes I am purchasing. Like this I purchased because truly I want to like basically collect the midi palettes at this point in time. But if this was any other brand, I would not have purchased this palette because I know these just aren't my shades. So I'm also trying to use this just as, you know, a series to kind of see like, maybe I don't realize I have like 12 blue brown shades throughout my collection. So just another way to like evaluate my palette collection. Anyway, you guys, I am going to stop rambling. That is going to wrap it up for today's video. Again, stay tuned for the introduction to the next installment in this series. I'm super excited about it. And let me know if there is a shade or a palette aesthetic you'd like to see me reach for next. Other than that, thank you so much for sticking around to watch today's video and for supporting me and my channel as you guys always do. I love you guys so much, and I'll catch you in my next video. Bye.